through funding, counsel, and career development services. As part of our mission to amplify artists' voices and provide tools and community for artists to thrive, we are pleased to host these online workshops and conversations. We are also very honored to be a founding member of the Artist Relief Coalition. This series of conversations is meant to speak to you directly, applicants, fellow artists, supporters, and friends, in hopes of shedding some light on how this ongoing crisis is affecting the art world and how we're grappling with it. Before we launch into the conversation, I want to share just a little bit more about Artist Relief. Artist Relief is a coalition of national arts grant makers who have come together to support artists across the country during the COVID-19 crisis through both financial and informational resources. To date, we have provided $5,000 grants to 3,200 individual artists. That's almost $21 million given directly to artists in need. If you're an artist and want to apply, you can find our application online at artistrelief.org. It's meant to be straightforward and should only take about 10 minutes. If you've applied in the past and haven't received a grant, you can apply again in December. A recording of today's conversation, as well as our past conversations and artist wellness videos, including a new one on ritual closings with artist Nija Whitson, will stay available on the Artist Relief YouTube channel. These resources are presented with the support of Compound, a new contemporary art and wellness complex in Long Beach, California. Thanks so much to our friends at Compound. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and here on YouTube for updates about programming and more. Thank you for joining us today for our conversation, Making Space for Grief. This conversation will be live and we'll be taking questions from viewers via the YouTube chat. So please type your questions and comments there. It's such an honor to introduce today's speakers. Joining us this evening are Joan Morgan and Danielle José Older. Joan Morgan is an award-winning cultural critic, feminist author, and a pioneering hip-hop journalist. Her beautiful reflections on Artist Relief can be found on the State of Us video on the Artist Relief YouTube channel. We're so pleased to have her back with us for this conversation. Thank you, Joan. Joining Joan is Danielle José Older. Danielle is a lead story architect on the Star Wars cross-platform initiative, The High Republic, and the New York Times best-selling author of graphic and young adult novels. As this will be the last conversation in our series, we at Artist Relief felt this was a moment to reflect on the challenges and loss this year has posed and how we move forward. Joan helped introduce Artist Relief earlier this year, so it seemed especially fitting that she should be here to discuss where we go next and how, given all that's happened. With that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Joan and Danielle.
Hi, everybody. It's really good to be here virtually with you. And Danielle and I just felt it was really important to talk about grief. You know, there's been so much, we are in the middle of a global pandemic and what feels like constant upheaval. And we were both sort of feeling like we don't really make enough space to talk about that. I think that even under quote unquote normal circumstances, the old normal, that we're under a lot of pressure to produce. Certainly as artists, if you aren't a person who has like a full-time job and you're freelancing, productivity is not just how we pay our bills. It's also become kind of how we define our worth, you know? I call this grind culture. We boast about grinding. We boast about being busy. We boast about staying up late and getting it in. And we don't have language for when life happens and we simply are not capable of functioning that way. So I'm gonna share a little story about how that worked for me. So I would say by all counts, if you ask most people who know me and they ask me how I was functioning through the pandemic, they would say pretty well. You know, I'm blessed to have a job that I really love. I actually got hired started during the summer of the pandemic and was hired during the pandemic. And I moved, I got a new apartment. My kid is relatively okay. And I really thought, this is hard, but I'm okay. And then about 3 weeks ago, I had a pinched nerve in my shoulder. And then it shot down my arm to carpal tunnel, and I was in an incredible amount of pain. And when acupuncture wasn't working, I went to go see my masseuse, and he actually calls it COVID shoulders. He said that what's happening is that all of our shoulders, to deal with this stress, are imperceptibly working their way up like this until they inevitably pinch. And he has a series of people coming in with the same complaint that I do. He gave me stretches, suggested some CBD for anxiety, but really he said, you're not gonna get better until you release. And I didn't think I had been storing all that much until I realized that there wasn't a day that went by that I didn't worry about someone in my immediate family getting COVID-19. My mother had been in a rehab, and we found out later that particular rehab in New York City, that people were dying by the dozens and family members didn't know. Both of my brothers are essential workers. I was separated from my son for 6 months. He eventually did get COVID. He is fine, thank goodness. But I was constantly worried about it. And as soon as I had someone tell me that I could acknowledge it, the pain started to subside little by little, but really, I think I cried every day for 3 weeks, not necessarily knowing why I was crying, but because I had to let it go. And I realized that in all of my ability to function at this time, that I hadn't made space to grieve what is probably one of the most horrific incidents of our lifetime. I'm a New Yorker, so it was particularly heinous here at the very onset, and we were swathed in uncertainty. Certainly the last 4 years, and the presidency of the last 4 years has set us on a path that we are completely unfamiliar with, that we never know what to expect from day to day. As a woman of color, and certainly I think that it's fair to say that people of color are disproportionately affected by this crisis and by the last 4 years of governmental antics and policies. And so I wanted to just kick it with Daniel, who really is who I call when I'm stressed. And Daniel, I'm crying and I don't really know why. Can you help me figure out why I'm crying? We twin a little bit that way. And I wanted to be able to share with you some of the things that we've come up with about how to just really give grief its place and why. Daniel?
Thank you for that. Thank you so much, Joan, for having me. And thank you, Letitia, for interpretation. It's really an honor to be here. This conversation is so sacred. And I think it's so perfect that we are friends and our friendship is sacred. And that we're both workers of spirit and artists and healers to our core, that we be in conversation about this, and also that we ask that question, which I've struggled with I was a paramedic for 10 years. And so much of that time, that question was forefront of my mind: who heals the healers, right? Because right now, all of us are healers. There's no one that gets to not be a healer, because we are all in community with each other, and our community is on fire and people are dying all around us. And so we have to ask ourselves that question: who heals the healer? How do we heal ourselves? How do we look for the healing outside of ourselves when that's what we need? And I think what you said really speaks to a fundamental struggle about healing right now, which is that there's healing that happens in the moment of, there's instant healing, which is also coping. And then there's a very different kind of healing that happens after the fact. And we've all been constantly adjusting our alarm clocks to try to figure out when can that second stage of healing start and make it to that moment. And to your point, like, since the election, that's already been happening for people of color here and for a lot of other people. And that's already on top of entire lifetimes of that, of trying to figure out, when can I stop for a second and take a moment to myself? When can I really find the time to heal? When can I give myself that gift? And if you're not taught to do that, when does it happen? Who tells you? And so much of the time, again, to your point, we need someone to step in and actually give us permission and say, you have to heal. Like, this is a moment that you have to heal. For COVID, there is no end in sight right now. And that's a reality that we've all started to recognize at different moments and then forgotten and realized again. And that's what we have to struggle with. But that doesn't mean that we can't heal. It means we have to be intentional about how we're gonna heal, how we're gonna reach that second stage, even while we're still in the midst of the first.
Yeah. I have a lot to say, or some to say, about intentionality, but I think it's really important to talk about some of the elephants in the room that stop us from even getting to that point, right?
Yes.
So there's this sort of feeling that shame is abundant right now. I'm just gonna put that out, right? I've spoken to people who are survivors, even my own son talked to me about shame about getting it, right? Mom, I did everything that I thought I was supposed to do. I wasn't out partying. This idea that if I get sick, I could make other people sick. There are people actually I know who have COVID who have really been very secretive about it because they don't want to be shamed or shunned, right? Financial insecurity and precarity bring shame. That's just the kind of society that we live in. No one is really comfortable saying, I'm broke, I have help. I think artist relief has been so important because it's an invitation to claim that without shame, to ask for assistance.
Right.
And then again, this illusion that sort of social media gives us is that, well, everyone's being productive, everyone's doing lives, everyone's doing talks, everyone's doing this. I just defended a dissertation in December, right? And I thought maybe it was a dissertation, but I can't read. Like, I cannot, and I'm somebody that your background is my norm and has been for many years. I can't get through an entire book. And I did some research and it says that when you're in when people are in heightened states of stress, that your brain actually is geared to focus on what's in front of you, right? Mm-hmm. And not long-term focus. Like, it's more important for you to focus on what's in front of you so you don't get eaten by the lion, right? Than it is to wonder, like, what's happening 4 seasons from now? And we are actually in an evolutionary mode that is closer to our ancestors than we are. So long-term projects are difficult. But here's the thing about grief. We don't have as much control over it as we think we do. And what do I mean by that? If you don't make space for grief, it will show up in other ways anyway.
Right.
It will just show up in other ways anyway. It will find whatever crack or crevice, if that is your relationship, if that's you and your kids, if that is, wow, I really went through that whole bottle of wine. There's nothing left for dinner. I kind of drank it all while I was cooking and preparing. It will find a way in. And so intentionality for me is actually in part the invitation to let it in, to acknowledge and say, okay, you're here.
Exactly. It's that.
Now I've got to give you that space.
Right. And what are we going to do about it? There's so many things I want to say to what you said. You brought up so many great points that are exactly it. But I'll start with this. A lot of the skills that I learned over the course of my years as an artist and as a paramedic feel like they're in overdrive right now. By that I mean to exactly what you said, shame, right? Shame is, I think, something that every artist really has to contend with in a very upfront way. Otherwise, it will eat us alive. There is so much shame that society brings to the process of making art. whether it's people telling you, you know, you're not good enough or it's not a worthwhile thing to do, whether it's the syndrome, what's it called? Imposter syndrome, you know, whether it's just being a person of color or a non-male in any form, trying to do art. There's so many kinds of shame. And one of the things that I teach, whenever I teach writing, is that the process of writing has to begin with forgiveness. And that forgiveness has to be of the self first. Because otherwise we will sit down and instead of being creative or imaginative or anything else, we're just gonna be focused and obsessed with all the days behind us that we didn't spend writing, right? Like we're so good at that. And because there's advice out there to write every single day, otherwise you're not a writer or some other nonsense. There's so many different things about defining yourself as this or that. And all of it is a lie. Shame is a lie. It's a lie that people tell us about ourselves, which I think is Anais Nin that said that. And we carry it with us anyway, and we let it get in the way of our process and gum up our sense of self and our creativity and our flow and everything else. And that applies now because it also stops us from healing. It's so much harder to heal when you're in the cradle of shame and you can't get out of it because you're not forgiving yourself. You're finding, you know, other ways to punish yourself. And that's burnout, you know, and then we work ourselves too hard. And then we look on social media and imagine all the things that people are doing that we're not. And the other piece to your point too, is that right before everything hit last year sometime, I went through a period where I also wasn't reading. And that actually helped me and I'm a writer and I love reading. I'm just like you know, like, look, pleasure reading is one of my favorite things in life to do. And there was just a period when it wasn't happening. Like I would sit down and I couldn't focus and, you know, and I ended up kind of crawling back up by way of comic books and graphic novels. And even right there's a lot of shame that people will put on that, right? There's hierarchies of what counts as literature and everything else. But I love comic books and they are literature. And that's what got me back into reading these huge tomes. And I still read comic books, you know, but the point is like, there's always waxes and wanes to what we can take in and what we use to heal. And the main thing is like, are we paying attention to ourselves and listening to what we need? Because that's the other main piece of the creative process that I try to teach. Anytime I have a chance to talk to young writers or old writers or whoever, is that we need to learn how to listen.
Yes. So I'm so glad that you ended on listening because it's like, okay, so what intentionality, how do I actually accomplish that? Well, artists are intentional. All of us have practices, right? All of us have developed practices over the years. Like they vary widely. You have to make intentionality part of your practice. And the way that you do that is that you have to check in.
Right.
You have to check in. If your body is doing something strange, check in and really explore that. If you have had a mild headache for 3 days, check in and really explore that. If you feel your heart starts racing when people ask you to do things that you normally feel like you would say yes to, check in and explore that. Intentionality has to become part of our practice, and the check-in is critical to it, part of that intentionality.
Exactly, and as a skill, it's the idea of curiosity too, which I love. As a writer, you know, I love the idea of curiosity as in like the thing that pulls us is sending us a message.
Excuse me.
What the thing that pulls us is telling us something about whether it's for me, it's story, right? Story is my primary art. And so when I feel my curiosity perk up, it means that there's something there that I have to sort through to get to find what the heart of the story is. But this is also a skill that we use in healing. And I think that in itself right there is such a lesson, because I remember too, when I was an organizer, and I'm still an organizer, but you know, like on the streets, like getting rallies together type organizer, there were all these very strict regimented ideas about what is organizing, what is art, what is teaching, keep them separate, they're in their boxes, right? And that's a lie, that's not true, that's like shame. The reality is that for me, especially, I found that the way I became a good organizer was by allowing my creative brain to work. And the way that I became a better paramedic was by allowing my organizing brain to step in, right? The way that I've become a better teacher is allowing, again, that creativity, like the aspects of chaos and order that are always in tension with each other. there's creativity in everything, and all of these boxes overlap. And if we allow them to, and if we follow that curiosity, so then healing becomes a creative process. And sometimes that alone becomes the turning point for folks who are comfortable on the page or comfortable creating art. But when it comes to looking at themselves deeply, which is part of making art, right? It's very scary, and it should be. It is, it always is. But if we follow our curiosity, if we are intentional about cultivating curiosity. I love a story that Pema Chodron, who's a Shambhala Buddhist monk, who writes a lot of really, really good books about dealing with crisis, talks about how when she was a little girl, one of her friends had a recurring nightmare of being chased by monsters through her house. And she would have it constantly. And she asked her at one point, Pema asked the girl, she said, "What do the monsters look like?" And the next night, she went to sleep. And when the monster started chasing her, she turned around just for the purpose of answering the question. Just that, she just said, "Oh, I want to tell my friend, these are little girls." She said, "I want to tell my friend the answer. So let me check." And she stopped and she looked at the monsters, and she described them. And she said they had these kind of teeth and these kind of eyes, and then she came back and she told Pema, and the dream never came back. She, by confronting those monsters, she dealt with them. And obviously it's not always that simple, but what the message of that is that, like, when we allow ourselves to become curious about fear and to find out what's behind it, because fear is always masking, so often it's masking something. There's something else. For myself, I've had moments, and Joan, you were there for some of these moments when I was overwhelmed by fear, and I did the work to get through that fear, and beneath it was sadness, and the sadness was so profound, but also such a relief to finally get to it and allow it to come out, because the fear was in the way, and I had without realizing it, created concretely a realm of fear that would block myself from feeling the sadness. And when I got there, it was like this huge relief, to cry and to feel that true sadness instead of like a mix of all these things meshed into something that turned out to be fear.
Absolutely. I do, Daniel, this, a lot of my work is on Black women in pleasure. And I often get asked, as a Black woman, how do I get to pleasure? And it's really interesting because as I'm thinking through grief right now, as I'm working through these concepts around pleasure, the height of a pandemic, the answer is absolutely the same for both. You cannot get to pleasure if you do not believe that you are entitled to pleasure. You cannot make space for grief if you do not believe that you're entitled to grief.
That's right.
And so I would urge all of us to really honor the fact that we're entitled to feel exactly how we feel at this moment. If millions of people around the globe dying is not reason enough to be sad, is not reason enough to not want to get out of bed that day, is not reason enough to turn off your phone, is not reason enough to eat, I don't know, like too many cookies, whatever it is for you.
Right.
You are entitled in this moment. Like, so much of the language of our culture says we're supposed to push past it and soldier past it. Like, shit is fucked up. It's like really fucked up in a major way.
Yeah.
And I think if we can't acknowledge that right now, when in God's name do you have permission to be sad or to grieve?
Exactly.
You have to give yourself permission, understand that we are all entitled, and we're entitled because that is a critical part of our humanity, is to be able to feel the full range of these feelings.
And along with that, and you touched on this some, but I want to really take it aside and spend a moment with it. We are also entitled to pleasure in the midst of crisis. And I think we, on top of not allowing ourselves grief, we also block our own pleasure because it's survivor's guilt. Every single human on this planet right now is a survivor, period. Which means that we all have a collective case on some level, or certainly the potential for survivor's guilt. It's a very real thing, and it is intergenerational, and it is already seated in a lot of us for various different reasons. But we deserve joy. We deserve joy even amidst suffering. We deserve joy even as we're trying to understand our own grief. And shame will also disallow joy. And that's equally dangerous. And then I think, because I'll use myself again, like I've been very blessed during this time, and great things have happened, and I've found ways of meditating and finding my center. And I've also been terrified and depressed, and worried about everybody, and things have gone wrong too. And it's like both of those truths just stand right next to each other, and one of them doesn't have to be bigger than the other or truer than the other for me to feel both of those things. They're in the balance, and our job is really, at the end of the day, balance. It's to allow ourselves those feelings of grief, allow ourselves those feelings of joy, find a way to walk with them both and carry ourselves however that means in this world, in this realm, at this time period. And then the last thing I want to say about that is that for me, a lot of my work as a writer and as a person who thinks about writing and story comes back to the idea of crisis. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important note to hit here, because crisis at the end of the day, and we are in a crisis on multiple levels, right? Crisis means a turning point. And yes, this is a bad crisis by all the measures we can think of, for sure. And there is change all around us. We are in a time of change. And we've talked about Arundhati Roy, the writer, who's one of my favorite writers, who said the pandemic is a portal. And what the world that we create out of this portal is not the one that we left behind. And the more that we understand that, and the more intentionality we bring to creating that new world, that's up to us. That doesn't mean we don't get to rest. That doesn't mean that we have to feel bad and grind ourselves to the ground, to your point, to make sure we create the perfect world. That's not it. It's not about perfection. It's about understanding that there's no going back, as I'm sure has been said over and over. We're going forward into something new, but what we are in is a time of intense change. It is stressful, it is chaotic, there is joy, there is potential, there is possibility. Mostly there are new mythologies being created, new languages being created, and we are part of that. And we walk with those mythologies, with the mythology of this time, with those languages. And that requires us to be in a constant process of healing.
Yeah. So I just want to go back to sharing some things that I found really useful. I think that as artists, we are observers and reporters on culture and the world around us, right? So as artists, we often feel we need to have some sort of response. Mm-hmm. We also live in a culture where we have a 24-hour news cycle. There's people have opinions on Twitter 24/7, good, bad, and different. Sometimes you have to really give yourself permission to just opt out of the conversation.
Yes.
Why? The pause is critical, because you cannot be completely reflective on something while you are still in the midst of going through it. And I think that's a really difficult thing for us to accept right now in this, what Daniel was talking about, not being able to go back. Like there is no going back. There are new things, new norms being created, right, that sometimes people want us to comment and we don't really have anything to say. Yep. Don't feel obligated that you have to have something to say. Which brings me to another thing. Boundaries are beautiful right now.
Amen.
No, a really powerful tool. When you are asked, check in, and if it really feels like you don't want to do it,
don't do it. Don't do that shit. Yes.
Don't do it.
Absolutely.
Because the whole world is running on its own agenda right now. I need to do this. I need to stay on track. I need to make sure this is that. And so they're asking, but it's not really based on, like, as much as we would always love to think. It's about our expertise. It's about our voice. It's about this. It's about that. There's space. And the most uncomfortable thing to do in the midst of a crisis is to sit in space. The impulse is to fill it with something. Mm-hmm. A lot of what we're filling it with is noise, to be quite. Right. So if you really don't want to do it, don't step in and add to the noise. You know, I'm not saying if that work comes your way and you need to do it to put food on the table, that's a different set of considerations. But if you're being asked to do something that at the end of the day is not really for you, you know what I mean? It's not really going to make you feel a whole lot better or put food on your table. Give yourself permission to opt out of the conversation. Every single time you say no, it gets easier. And
True.
every single time you say no, it actually feels a lot better. It starts to feel really, really, really good.
Yes, I can confirm that. It is amazing. It's one of the best things as an artist. It is so freeing. It is empowering. It is incredible. And along with that, very connected to that is that in these unprecedented times, I think this is one of the hardest things. We also, along with the ability to be still and to say no, we have to allow room for not knowing and accepting the fact that we don't know. And that, I think, is cause for a lot of the terror that we feel and see on the Twitter streets. That's one of the reasons I stayed off social media for the most part on election night, because panic creates you to jump towards the worst possible conclusion, because you feel like, okay, if I'm being the most pessimistic possible person right now, at least, I'll be prepared for that horrible scenario. And that forms some kind of like shell around you that feels like it's protecting you when it's not. Just like silence isn't protecting us. Coming up with the worst possible scenario and running with it and then causing panic on Twitter over it will not protect anybody. That doesn't mean don't feel fear. Like we all, of course, like that's not necessarily up to us. I certainly, as a writer, as a fantasy writer, I'm very capable of playing out horrible scenarios. But I think what it means is that what it requires of us is that we recognize them for what they are, which is fantasy, which is us trying to fill the void of not knowing, the terror of not knowing, with something that is even more terrifying, but feels at least stable, right? Like the devil, when the reality is we don't know. And the political realm is the most obvious because it is utter chaos. It has been in an enhanced state of chaos in the worst way for the past 4 years. Every pundit has been wrong about almost everything. And that is a difficult reality, I say, as a political nerd who loves watching the news, or used to, that we have to reckon with, right? And it's scary not knowing. And but that doesn't mean that we know. And us thinking of terrible scenarios doesn't mean we know. It just means we're more stressed because we thought of how bad it could possibly be.
So I just said that no is powerful, but I think, Daniel, you and I, as people who consider ourselves people who do healing work, what you say yes to is incredibly powerful.
Word.
What you say yes to that actually sits well in your spirit, that is aligned with where you are and who you are in the moment, actually creates more of itself. Mm-hmm. So if nothing else, understand that if you are saying yes to things that you don't want to do, you will create more of that thing that you don't want to do. Mm-hmm. If you say yes to your own alignment and intentionality, trust me, you create more of the thing that you want to say yes to. It is just really one of those wonderful laws of the universe. What we say yes to, we create more of.
That's true. I had a session with my literary agent a couple of weeks ago, and we did the 5-year plan. And it was something we'd been talking about doing since I first started working with her a year ago, and it just hadn't worked out. And then for whatever reason, I think at some point, we were like, I'm not going to New York anytime soon, so we might as well do this over Zoom. So we had this session, and as much as it was affirming professionally to me and exciting to think about all the projects that were ahead and everything else, there was a level to which emotionally I hadn't realized that the next 5 years don't feel in any way like they will even happen necessarily. Like there's a part of me that is like, apocalypse could be any given moment, more so than I've ever felt in my life. And that's what we've become trained to because of this ongoing series of crises and bad news that we constantly subject ourselves to and are subjected to because it's reality. On the other hand, we will be here in 5 years, and we will be writing books and telling stories and creating things. And the best thing we can do right now is plan for that, and not in a overly like over the top, you know, just like rigid concrete way where it's like, okay, this is what it's going to be and whatever thing. No, with fluidity, right? With creativity, using those same creative muscles that we use to tell stories, to write songs, to do all the different forms of creativity we do. We put that into our careers, into our dreams, into our futures. And this wasn't, the beautiful thing about this meeting was that it wasn't just a strictly career meeting. You know, it was talking about family. It was talking about political ideas. It was talking about spirit. And that's something I would encourage everybody to do, whether you have an agent or not, even if it's with a best friend, even if it's just with yourself. Sit down and ask yourself what you see for yourself in the next 5 years. Like, what would an ideal scenario be? What are steps that you could take to get there? Now more than ever, because things feel so uncertain and scary, and because we don't know, that's when you lean into the future and to the ideas and the possibilities that are out there. That's when you create mythology.
Do you guys have any questions for us?
I would love to take some questions.
I'd love to talk to y'all.
No questions so far, it says.
Oh, okay.
Huh, look at that.
Daniel, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, I do actually. I know you and I talked some, and you brought up earlier in this chat, you know, just about like people you love catching COVID, and people I know have had it. And I wanted to ask you about that process of like, because we're sort of talking in very broad terms, right, about the crisis in the world, right? But you've experienced it very close to home, with people that you care about, and you've gone through the motions of understanding different kinds of prayer, different kinds of reflection on that. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. No, I think that worrying about other people is probably one of the more difficult kinds of worry, because you have to accept that certain things are completely not within your control.
Right.
And so that's really difficult for me. I believe that various practices, from the CDC to my spiritual practices, created a really reasonable sense of sanity for me. I don't know that any of us can like claim safety. But
exactly.
When you're worrying about other people, that's tremendously difficult because you don't have any control. And so the first thing I had to understand was that I didn't have any control. I think the strongest evidence of that was when my son got COVID. We had structured so many things when he came to New York about how we were going to conduct our social lives. You know, we take care of my elderly mother, his grandmother, who's pretty fragile. And so we really felt like we had like worked it out. You know, I spent way too much money on his ticket back to LA to make sure he could fly under like what I thought were the safest circumstances. And then COVID walked right into his house with two of his roommates who really weren't doing anything except living in a city that is very anti-mask. And, you know, in New York, to give you an example, we are worried about a second wave and approaching 3% transmission rate. Orange County, California, had no rules, no regulations, had lifted them all at a 5% transmission rate. Ooh. He was gonna get COVID, right? There was just no questions about that. And so when he called, he was tested several times and the results were good. More roommates were testing positive. I'd already moved him. When he called and he said he was positive, what I had to realize in that moment was that I have to let go. And by let go, I made a series of phone call texts. I texted you, I texted the village, I texted the army. I was like, you guys have to all, they were like, what does he need? I was like, you have to communicate with him. because I am going to fall out on this floor and like wail and give you like a Ghanaian funeral wailing service. And then like I need to do that. And then I need to just kind of zone out and do absolutely nothing for the next 24 hours. And then I can spring back into action. So I think that that was really important because I had to realize that my worst fear was happening. I was in the midst of it. I had to look it in the face. I had to say, this is where you're capable. This is where you are not. And the work that you have done in terms of your son is setting up a really strong village throughout all of his life. So I didn't have to carry that, alone. But, you know, it was like the little girl with the nightmare. Like I had to turn around and look at it and be like, okay, you're here. How are we gonna handle that?
And you did, and like that was something that was really inspiring for me during that time, is that you were very real about what you needed, what your process was, and you allowed yourself to take it. You know, you weren't trying to pretend that it was all right, and you weren't trying to, you know, like do any of the possible reactions that could happen. You just looked at it very squarely, and there was nothing cold, there was nothing calculated about it. It was very emotional, because you were dealing with it in a very real way. I feel like there's a part of this conversation that revolves around the idea of masculinity too, you know, of this mask that particularly cis men insist that we wear and carry, you know, to protect everybody and defend everybody. And like, as much as we've tried to deconstruct gender roles so much, you know, over the past centuries, there's a lot of ways that we haven't, that we still live in a society that teaches us these things. And it's something I've had to check in with myself very explicitly about, because I know, you know, as much as I surround myself with feminists and have been raised by people who believe in gender equality and didn't tell me to like man up ever, you know, society still tells us these things and we still walk with them. And particularly in times of crisis, things like that really do rear their heads, these different forms of privilege and power, and these different, I think, really unhealthy notions of who we need to be. And I felt that coming into the election, certainly coming into last week, just the idea of like, okay, I need to feel what I feel, and I also need to keep it together and not fall apart completely, to make sure that the people around me are safe and feel safe. And that's a tricky tightrope to walk, you know, especially when no one's actually telling you to do that except your own mind by way of society, or society by way of your own mind. Because the people around me love me and don't demand that I perform for them, you know, and all the work that I've done of thinking about gender and doing organizing around it is real and helps. But at the end of the day, like, we're all still trying to navigate through what it means to survive and to, you know, be strong, what that means, and be vulnerable at the same time. So I feel really blessed to have women like you, Joan, my wife, my mom, you know, amazing people, my dad in my life who don't do that, right? But I think we all need to still really confront those things inside of us, whatever they are, that demand the inhuman of us, that demand the impossible of us, and expect us to just, you know, like push through it, or whatever unhealthy thing we've been taught.
We have a question. It's a great question. I'm wondering if you can speak on how or if this moment of grief has interrupted an existing creative process, a development of a work with a deadline for you. And thank you for making this space. Thank you for the question. It certainly has. It certainly has. I have a script that needs to be done, and for the long term, particularly during that first 100 days of COVID, when New York was just having our death rates were just off the charts. I wasn't leaving my apartment for like 10, 12 days at a time. I look back now, I was pretty much a wreck. I don't know that I really understood it then. And I was alone, which I think that if you are a person who has gone through those lockdowns alone, that's a very different experience than if you actually have someone else in your physical space. It's a profound sense of isolation. And so I had to, one, reach out. This is what I mean about like boundaries, is reach out and just honestly be like, I can't do it. I'm not functioning well. And I really thought the world might fall apart. And lo and behold, my producer said, okay. I get it. It's really rough over here too. And I still felt though, I wanted to write, I wanted to create, but those characters were not speaking at all. Like they were on mute.
Right.
So remember I told you I had very short attention span. What I could do was go back to songwriting.
Yes. Because
it was economy of words and simple thoughts and emotions and expressions that I wrote some really good, you read them, Daniel, they were really good song lyrics.
Absolutely.
During that time. And so I had to just meet myself creatively where I was. And then lo and behold, once I did that, the characters slowly started speaking again. And now I can start, and now I'm just kind of pumping it out. So I knew instinctively that I needed to create something to try to break through, but I had to switch in terms of form. And I really did just have to ask for grace and permission. It's not coming. It's just not going to come. I realize not everybody has that option, but quite frankly, like in those first 100 days, what really had to happen? The entire country was on lock.
Right.
Like, this idea that something had to happen was not particularly realistic anyway. What were we going to do with that?
Right, exactly. Everything is delayed. For me, it's more in much smaller ways, I think, but ways that can add up. So I write for larger worlds, really just Star Wars, and then I write my own stuff. And I've been very acutely aware since this started that I have a very real limit of what I can do for other people's worlds. I love doing it and I'm excited to do it, particularly like comic book writing, which is small bursts. It's a lot like songwriting, which is a whole other panel and conversation we should have one day. But a whole novel is like such an intense form of grinding. And I finished the novel that I had to do for them right before I think lockdown started, which worked out really well. So the larger project I'm working on now that's a novel is my own world, my own heart, and also lines up in very eerie and comforting ways with the world that we're living right now. Literally like the news cycle, point for point, sometimes matches things that are happening in the book, which wasn't something I designed, but tends to happen with my writing anyway. So it's become a form of being in conversation with the world that I have found really healing. A. B, learning to take weekends off changed my entire game as a freelancer, as an artist, in every other way. And it's something, for some reason, all these years I've been freelancing, I never really bothered to do, but it's become so important in this lockdown period. So really just having those 2 days that are not to be used for work and really sticking to that has changed so much. It's given me grace, it's given me time, it's given me something to look forward to. And that includes looking forward to Mondays to get back into it, because I love work and I love writing and I need breaks. And that's hard to figure out sometimes when you love what you do. Sometimes that can really be a recipe for burnout, right? But if you have those implemented days, whatever they may be, whether sometimes it's keeping Sabbath for some people, and that regiment helps you create a rhythm to your work. And that has been really helpful. And then also just writing a section and putting it down for a week and working on a bunch of other stuff, whatever it may be. Notice that the sun is dramatically setting on my face as we speak. I didn't know that either. But that's been really helpful. So that's been part of what's gotten me through this and keeping me productive.
Yeah, so I think in terms of just like creative practice, the deadline is the big looming thing, right? So yeah. I think it's just really sort of important to kind of get yourself through that, to try to find something that you enjoy where stakes are low.
Right.
So it really did help me to kind of go, okay, today I'm gonna work on this song thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't have a recording contract. I don't have,
Right.
there's no one waiting on it. It's just
Right.
that I'd like to get it out. And just that holding on to that little thing did allow me eventually to get back to the bigger thing that I needed to do.
And then asking yourself too, like, what actually rests your mind when you're not working? So like back to the reading conversation, right? Like there's probably a way in which reading isn't providing the restfulness that we need because of what you said. For me, I found like video games are really, really helpful. Like I can really tune out and turn my brain it goes into a different mode. And that allows me to rest more thoroughly in this moment, as opposed to picking up a book. And that changes, and that's always in motion, just like our artistic process is always in motion, which really is what comes back to that anchor of being able to listen, being able to check in, being able to see what we need at that moment.
I think there's another question.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Daniel.
How do we help others make space for grief? That is a great question. Oh, there's another one. We could skip it. No, I'm just kidding. It's a really good question. Joan, do you have a good answer?
I don't know if it's a good answer, but one of the things that I think is really important, I was talking to another friend, Jay Goldbass, about this, and we have a way as a culture where we ask people how they're doing and we don't really listen for the response.
Right.
People know you're not listening, so they just say fine.
Right.
Right? Ask another question.
Mm-hmm.
Ask another question. If you feel, particularly people who are alone in this period, right? Who are not living with family, who are isolated from their friend groups, really do a check-in and let them know that you're checking in, that you're not just calling to chit chat or shoot the shit. You really are like, yo, I need to really know how you're doing. Right? And really listen to the response and think of the ways, because when people are grieving or spiraling because it feels so out of control, it really helps to know that the person on the other hand has thought ahead about how they can show up.
Right.
So you don't have to fix it, you know what I mean? And you don't need to overextend yourself in ways that you're not capable. But let's say you are like, look, I'm usually up till 3 a.m. If you need to talk at 1 o'clock in the morning, call me. Mm-hmm. Right? And you can do that. If someone is really stressed about food, be like, yo, hold on. I have done this during the pandemic. Go get somebody like a gift card, like a grocery, what do you call those?
Gift certificate?
Right.
Yeah.
Or, there's a whole lot of Venmo and Cash App application, activity going on around that. Think about the ways when you ask how you can actually show up. And why is that important? Because if you ask someone and then they tell you, because making yourself vulnerable enough to express that you are grieving or sad, and the person on the end is like, yo, that's messed up, and has nothing for you, that is not helpful, like at all. So take a beat and really think about, how can I show up and be present before you ask how that person is doing, and really listen to the answer.
Yes, and coupled with that, back to the boundaries conversation, it can't be everyone. Like you can't be there for everyone in your life. I think this is compounded by social media, where people are actively working out their fears and anxieties in front of huge audiences. And to be able to actually be there for anybody, it requires us to be able to say no. It requires us to not try to be there for everybody, which is A, burnout, B, a sort of a terrifying notion unto itself. Like, I know when I think about trying to be there like for a mystical who knows who / everybody, it's like, absolutely not. But when I think about the individual people in my life that I am able to show up for, and then check in with my own boundaries about when and how, that's manageable and that's real, and that requires a tough conversation with yourself about what you can and can't do, And sometimes a tough conversation with someone else about the fact that they need to not call on you for certain things. That's part of healing. That's part of your healing, and that's part of their healing. Because ultimately, if you're failing them, you're not doing them any good if you're showing up pretending you can show up when you can't. And that's hard. Those aren't easy things to do, but that is how we get better as a whole. And I think if you have the conversation honestly, it can allow you to move forward. And it also ties in really nicely to the next question, which is, how do you feel that grief relates to the soul, spirit, purpose, and how can artists create from that space? What a beautiful question. I give it to you, Joan. I could take it if you want.
I think that the answer is not specific to grief. I think it's about the honesty that we talked about early on, right? Because that is really the most powerful space that I think any artist creates from, is that when you have really done the check-in, you're willing to acknowledge just the funky reality of where you are, and being willing to own it. I think that that's when we create our best work. I think that's when we create our most powerful work. I think that when we look at fear and can really acknowledge what I'm feeling right now is fear, not just for myself, but for those I love, for future generations to come, that's where the most powerful work comes in. So I think I talked before about alignment. You cannot be in alignment with your spirit or your purpose without that level of honesty. You have to be intentional about checking in about where you are. And you also have to realize, even if you are a person who is a healer in whatever faith, practice, manner, if you're a person that people call to be for reassurance and for help at these particular moments, you have to be really honest about how capable you are of helping, right? So like you and I talked about this, you and I really pray. So if you say to Daniel and I, can you pray for us? There's a whole series of like our spiritual practice where, trust me, we are putting in work, like there are beads of sweat, like there are things that are really happening. And I started to realize at a certain point that people would ask, and I couldn't do it for everybody. Like, because most people, when they say I'm praying for you, they mean I'm thinking good thoughts about your situation and I want it to be better, right? And I could do that, but like that other thing I had to realize is an expendable and exhaustible resource.
Yes. No, exactly that. I love that you brought it to prayer, because that's what I was thinking too. Because
2 minutes left.
2 minutes, you said?
Yes. So bring us home, Daniel.
Bring it home. Like so many things we've been talking about, I think prayer fits within that realm of everything is a part of it. Prayer is about creativity. Prayer is about healing. Prayer is about organizing. It's so many things, So when I'm in the artistic process, my brain is working in very much the same way it does when it prays, because it's a conversation. It's always a call and response that you're having with spirit or the universe or God or Orisha. You are hearing, you are listening, and it always comes back to listening, and you're speaking, and you are invoking, and you are calling down, and you are cleansing. Prayer happens in action. So we think of it as like hands together and the words you speak, but prayer is also how you move through the world. It's the names that you call out. It's the way that you walk. It's how you move through the small moments of your life when you prepare yourself for different things, whether they're gigantic or small. Those are all forms of prayer. And I think that's coupled with this idea that Joan, you put so beautifully, which is that it's the larger question. It's always, how do we bring grief into our work, and how do we move through it, in a creative way? It's also, how do we do that with joy? It's also, how do we do that with spirit? It's also, how do we do that with survival, with the struggles that we have? That's the artistic process, is taking those things and making some kind of harmony with them inside of ourselves, and then putting them back out. I love the James Baldwin quote about feeling alone in the world with his sorrows and his fears until he opened a book, and just how gigantic that is, and that discovery of like, we have these different things in common, and that doesn't mean we're all the same. That's not like a loosey-goosey, like hallelujah thing where everything's one. But it does mean that we can have these conversations across huge distances of time and space. And that in itself is a form of prayer.
Absolutely. I say to my students often, bring your entire self into every room.
Mm, mm,
Bring your entire self into every room, that there's no part of you that you should feel comfortable leaving behind in
mm,
order to fit into that room. And by that, and by the room, I mean the creative process.
mhm,
Right?
mhm,
Bring your entire self into that room.
mhm. When I was a medic, people used to be like, how do you even sleep at night with all the stuff that you see? But it was like, first of all, I sleep great because I save people's lives. That's what I do. It's amazing sleep. Second of all, it's that word see carries a lot of weight, right? Because we weren't seeing people be hurt. We were actively participating in their healing. And that's a very different experience. I have been on both sides of that, and they're totally different. And when you are actively participating, you are also healing yourself. That in itself is prayer. And that is how we recover. Not by burning ourselves out and overdoing it for other people, but by being aware of ourselves and how we move through the world and the different forms of prayer and the different forms of healing, and not allowing the sorrow of the time to just wash over us and take us away.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you
Thanks,
for spending
everybody.
time with us. Okay.
Thank you so much. This has been incredible, Joan and Daniel. Thank you so much for your vulnerability and your truth today, and for addressing a topic that is relevant for so many. It was an honor to have you, and we really appreciate you taking the time out for this important conversation. Thank you also to everyone who joined us tonight and for your support of Artist Relief. Again, for those out there watching, the fund will operate through December, so ensure to apply at artistrelief.org. Stay well and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, interpreters. Thank you, everybody. Take care.